Imagine the pre-dawn darkness, so thick and palpable that it feels as if you could cut it with a knife. This is not the cozy darkness of a modern bedroom protected by double-glazed windows and heavy curtains. This is the cold, damp gloom of industrial London or Manchester at the end of the 19th century. The streets are empty, save for a few rare patrols and strange figures creeping along the brick facades of working-class neighborhoods. The silence is broken not by a piercing electronic beep or a cheerful smartphone melody. The sound is entirely different, dry, rhythmic, persistent, yet strangely delicate. A tap, another tap, a rustling against the glass. Below, on the cobblestones wet with morning dew, stands a man. He is dressed in a worn coat, his breath exhaling in clouds of steam. In his hands, he holds a long, incredibly long pole, resembling a giant fishing rod. He raises it to the window of the third floor, where a tired factory worker sleeps behind the murky glass. The tip of the pole, wrapped in soft wire or rags, touches the frame. 1, 2, 3. The man in the street does not leave. He waits. His job is not just to knock. His mission, his sacred duty, and his sole source of livelihood is to ensure that life inside the room has stirred. Only when a candle flickers in the window or a sleepy face presses against the glass, giving a conditional signal, will the figure with the pole nod, lower his instrument, and disappear into the fog, to repeat the ritual 10 meters away at the next house. Thus began the morning for millions of people in an era when time became money. But the tools for measuring it were still a luxury. This is the story of a profession that today seems like a fairy tale invention, but just 100 years ago was the bloodstream of the entire industrial economy. This is the story of human alarm clocks, guardians of other people's time, who sold their sleep so that others could wake up. To understand how the need for a person walking the streets and knocking on windows even arose, one must comprehend the tectonic shift that occurred in human consciousness with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. For millennia, people lived by the sun. Sunrise meant the beginning of labor, sunset its completion. A peasant did not need an alarm clock. He was awakened by roosters, the lowing of cows, or simply the light filtering through the cracks in the shutters. Time was cyclical, fluid, natural. But then came factories, mines, and docks. A machine, unlike a cow, knows no fatigue and is not dependent on the sun. A steam engine requires coal and maintenance around the clock. Factory owners introduced the concept of shifts. Now, work could begin at 4 in the morning, at midnight, or at noon. Natural rhythms were broken. Mechanical time, dictated by the whistle and the clock face, replaced solar time. But here's the paradox. Having demanded pinpoint accuracy from people, civilization had not yet provided them with an affordable means to control this time. Mechanical clocks at the beginning of the 19th century cost a fortune. An ordinary worker, living from paycheck to paycheck, simply could not afford the luxury of owning a personal chronometer at home. Moreover, the consequences of being late were catastrophic. The system of fines in Victorian factories was characterized by draconian cruelty. Being 5 minutes late could cost a worker a day's wages. Being an hour late often meant immediate dismissal. In a world where a queue of hungry unemployed stood outside the factory gates, losing one's job was tantamount to the ruin of a family. The fear of not waking up on time became the working class's chief nightmare. People went to bed in tension, woke up every hour in a cold sweat, leading to chronic sleep deprivation and, as a result, an even greater risk of oversleeping. It was into this gap between the system's demands and human capabilities that they entered. Professional knockers up. The economy always creates supply where there is demand, born of fear. For a few pennies a week, these people took responsibility for your awakening. They became a living insurance against dismissal. The external layer of this profession, how it looked from the outside, was surprisingly diverse and inventive. One might think, what could be simpler than knocking on a door? But knocking on the common door of an apartment building was out of the question. It would wake up all the neighbors, causing a wave of anger and, possibly, a visit from the police for disturbing the peace. It was necessary to wake up a specific person in a specific room, often on the second, third, or fourth floor. The tools of the knockers up evolved with urban architecture. The long bamboo pole became the most recognizable symbol of the profession. These poles were true engineering solutions of artisanal production. Lightweight, strong, and sectional, like modern fishing rods, they allowed reaching the upper floors of narrow English townhouses. At the end of such a pole, a peculiar hammer made of wire, wrapped in cloth, was often attached so that the sound would be heard, but the glass remained intact. However, bamboo was an expensive pleasure, and many used long, thin slats twisted together. But there were virtuosos of a different kind. Mary Smith, the legendary knocker-up from East London, went down in history. She didn't need a cumbersome pole, which was awkward to maneuver in a crowd or to flee from hooligans. Mary used a blowpipe. She would fill her mouth with dried peas and, with sniper-like precision, shoot them at clients' windows. The sound of peas hitting the glass was sharp enough to wake a sleeper, but quiet enough not to disturb neighbors behind the wall. In addition, this method had an undeniable advantage. The ammunition left no trace of the crime. Birds would peck them away. There were also heavyweights of the profession who worked in areas with low-rise buildings. They used short clubs or canes, with which they would knock directly on doors or lower windows. Some used rattles, similar to those used by night watchmen. However, the elite were considered to be those who could delicately wake a client on the fourth floor without disturbing anyone else. The economics of this process were simple but harsh. The client paid a fixed sum per week. This was usually around sixpence, which constituted a small but tangible part of a worker's budget. However, there was also a premium system. If you slept particularly soundly or had allowed yourself an extra pint at the pub the night before, you could arrange for a more persistent awakening for an additional fee. In the knocker-up's code of honor, there was an iron rule: never leave until the client signals. This distinguished a professional from an amateur. An amateur would knock and move on. A professional would stand in the rain and snow, continuing their monotonous work until a sleepy face appeared in the frame. If the client didn't wake up, the knocker-up might even throw small stones, carefully, or shout, risking an encounter with a constable. After all, if the client overslept, they wouldn't pay next week. The mutual dependence was absolute. However, behind the facade of amusing tools and street romance lay a deep internal conflict, a drama of human destinies. Who were these people, willing to get up at 3 in the morning to wake others? Most often, they were those whom the ruthless machine of capitalism had spat out onto the roadside. Elderly women, widows, disabled people, war veterans who had lost their health but retained their discipline. For them, this job was the only way to maintain dignity and not beg. Police often knew the local knocker-ups by sight and treated them with condescension. In a way, these people performed a function of social stabilization. They were the living rhythm of the city. But there was also a deep tragedy of loneliness in their work. They were shadows. They came when the city slept and disappeared when the city woke up. Their communication with clients was limited to a knock and a nod through the glass. Years of such work created a strange, distanced intimacy. The knocker-up knew which room the drunkard slept in, and which the young mother, exhausted by shifts. He knew the secrets of the streets that only reveal themselves at 4 in the morning. The gender aspect is particularly interesting. Many of the most famous knocker-uppers were women. Mrs. Bowers, who worked with her dog, became a local celebrity. For Victorian women, this was one of the few opportunities to earn money without becoming a domestic servant or factory worker. It gave the illusion of independence. She was her own boss, the owner of her route and her time. But the price of this independence was a life lived in perpetual twilight, in cold and dampness. Arthritis and rheumatism were occupational diseases of the stick people. And here we come to the deepest, most philosophical layer of this story. The existence of the knocker-upper profession exposes the paradox of the industrial age, humanity's attempt to mechanize itself. The knocker-upper was a living prosthesis, a crutch for a society that tried to reject its biological nature. Humans are not designed to wake up to a whistle, and since the human body clock resisted this violence, an external agent, an overseer, was needed. The knocker-upper was not just a service worker, he was the first link in the chain of disciplinary control. In this system arose a recursive question, which became the subject of children's rhymes and philosophical jokes of the time. Who wakes the knocker-upper? This seemingly simple question actually touches upon the problem of the first cause and infinite regress. In reality, the answer was prosaic. Knocker-uppers often didn't go to bed at all until their shift ended. They were night dwellers. Either they slept during the day, reversing their circadian rhythm, or they relied on the internal demons of insomnia common in old age. But in the popular imagination, this question acquired a mystical overtone. It seemed that there must be some _2_ who set this entire giant mechanism of city life in motion. Sometimes curiosities occurred, revealing the absurdity of the system. There were cases where knocker-uppers hired other knocker-uppers to wake them before their shift. Entire chains of awakening emerged. It was a living network, transmitting the signal of time from person to person, unlike today's atomized system where everyone communicates only with their gadget. This created a strange sense of community. The street woke up together. A knock on one window was a signal for everyone. A new day had begun. It was time to get up. The transformation of this reality began imperceptibly, but it was inevitable. The enemy of the man with the pole was not the police or competitors, but progress. By the mid-20th century, technology began to become cheaper. The mechanical alarm clock, once a luxury item adorned with brass and wood, turned into a stamped tin product available to everyone. The winding mechanism became more reliable and louder. Electricity began to penetrate homes, bringing with it electric clocks that did not need to be wound. Moreover, the very structure of cities changed. Old quarters were demolished, and multi-story buildings rose in their place. Try to reach a window on the 10th floor with a stick. Architecture began to work against the profession. Apartment building doors started to be locked with complex locks. Intercoms appeared, in their primitive forms, and access to windows became limited. The street ceased to be an open space. It became a transit zone. But perhaps the strongest blow was the change in attitudes towards work and time after the World Wars. Wars accelerated technological development and standardization. Radio entered every home, and morning broadcasts began to serve as a nationwide alarm clock. The announcer, in a cheerful voice, announced the time, and the need for a person with a pea shooter fell away by itself. However, the profession did not disappear instantly. It died slowly, resisting the onslaught of gears and springs. In some areas of industrial England, especially in the north, where traditions were strong and people were poor, knock-uppers worked until the early 70s of the 20th century. These were the last of the Mohicans, living relics of a bygone era. They continued to walk their routes when cars were already driving around and jet planes were flying in the sky. The culmination of this story can be considered the moment when the last knock-upper hung his pole on a nail. We know the names of some of them, but the name of the very last one is surely lost to history. Imagine that day. A man who had woken up a district for decades suddenly realizes that his client list is empty. Everyone bought alarm clocks. Everyone switched to automation. At this moment, something more than just losing a job happens. A living thread connecting neighbors is broken. When you buy an alarm clock, you buy independence, but you also buy loneliness. If your alarm clock breaks, no one will come to check why you haven't gotten up. No one will throw pebbles at your window, worrying about your earnings. The mechanism doesn't care. The person did care. With the departure of knock-uppers from urban life, a certain amount of humanity and care left, albeit paid for with pennies. The denouement of this drama happened quietly. Newspaper headlines were filled with news about space flights and atomic energy, while in the back alleys of Manchester, some old lady simply stopped going out in the mornings with her stick. The profession dissolved into the past, becoming folklore, a funny picture in a history textbook. But what resonance does this story have today? Why is it important for us to know about people with bamboo sticks? Because it is a mirror of our current struggle with time. We have replaced people with gadgets, but the problem remains. We are still slaves to the schedule, only now our overseer lives under our pillow. We hate the sound of the alarm clock, just as a Victorian worker might have hated a knock on the window, but we cannot live without it. The lesson of the knocker-uppers lies in the value of human contact. In that world, waking up was an act of interaction. Today, it is an act of isolation. We wake up alone, put on headphones, stare at a screen. We have lost the sense that our time is synchronized with the community. We are synchronized with servers, not with neighbors. Moreover, the story of the knocker-uppers reminds us of the fragility of professions. Those people probably thought their work would be needed forever, because people always need to wake up. They could not foresee the microchip or the quartz resonator. This is a powerful reminder for us today as we watch the development of artificial intelligence. Any function that can be automated will be automated. And even the most intimate human service can be replaced by an algorithm. In conclusion, I want to return to the image we started with. A foggy morning, the tapping of peas against the glass. Now that you know what lies behind that sound, it is perceived differently. It is not just noise. It is the sound of care, the sound of survival, the sound of a bygone era when time still had a human face. Today, when you set your alarm for 6 in the morning, pause for a moment to reflect. This simple act holds the memory of thousands of people who walked cold streets, clutching bamboo poles in their numb hands so that the world could keep turning. Their footsteps have long since faded. The peas have crumbled to dust. The poles have rotted or been used for firewood. But every time we open our eyes, torn from sleep by the necessity of going to work, we continue the same battle with our own nature, in which they were the first soldiers. We are still waiting for a knock on the window. Only now, it comes from inside the black mirror on the bedside table, cold and indifferent, like eternity. and no one will stand under your window until they are sure you are truly awake and ready to face this world. Now that is solely your responsibility.